Chapter 6 of the Lancashire Witches. This recording is in the public domain. Reading by Andy Minter. The Lancashire Witches, a Romance of Pendle Forest, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Introduction. The Last Abbot of Whalley. Chapter 6 Teter et Fortis Carcer. Left alone and unable to pray, the abbot strove to dissipate his agitation of spirit by walking to and fro within his chamber; and while he was thus occupied, he was interrupted by a guard, who told him that the priest sent by the Earl of Derby was without, and immediately afterwards the confessor was ushered in. It was the tall monk, who had been standing between the biers, and his features were still shrouded by his cowl. At the sight of him, Paslew sank upon a seat, and buried his face in his hands. The monk offered him no consolation, but waited in silence till he should again look up. At last Paslew took courage and spoke. "Who and what are you?" he demanded. "A brother of the same order as yourself," replied the monk in deep and thrilling accents, but without raising his hood. "And I am come to hear your confession by command of the Earl of Derby." "Are you of this abbey?" asked Paslew, tremblingly. "I was," replied the monk, in a stern tone; "but the monastery is dissolved, and all the brethren ejected." "Your name?" cried Paslew. "I am not come here to answer questions, but to hear a confession," rejoined the monk. "Bethink you of the awful situation in which you are placed, and that before many hours you must answer for the sins you have committed. You have yet time for repentance, if you delay it not." "You are right, father," replied the abbot. "Be seated, I pray you, and listen to me, for I have much to tell. 31 years ago I was prior of this abbey. Up to that period my life had been blameless, or, if not wholly free from fault, I had little wherewith to reproach myself, little to fear from a merciful judge, unless it were that I indulged too strongly the desire of ruling absolutely in the house in which I was then only second. But Satan had laid a snare for me, into which I blindly fell. Among the brethren was one named Borlace Alvetham, a young man of rare attainment and singular skill in the occult sciences. He had risen in favour, and at the time I speak of was elected sub prior." "Go on," said the monk. "It began to be whispered about within the abbey," pursued Paslew, "that on the death of William Rede, then abbot, Borlace Alvetham would succeed him, and then it was that the bitter feelings of animosity were awakened in my breast against the sub prior, and after many struggles I resolved upon his destruction." "A wicked resolution," cried the monk; "but proceed." "I pondered over the means of accomplishing my purpose," resumed Paslew, "and at last decided upon accusing Alvetham of sorcery and magical practices. The accusation was easy, for the occult studies in which he indulged laid him open to the charge. He occupied a chamber overlooking the Calder, and used to break the monastic rules by wandering forth at night upon the hills. When he was absent thus, one night, accompanied by others of the brethren, I visited his chamber, and examined his papers, some of which were covered with mystical figures and cabalistic characters. These papers I seized, and a watch was set to make a prisoner of Alvetham on his return. Before dawn he appeared, and was instantly secured and placed in close confinement. On the next day he was brought before the assembled conclave in the chapter house, and examined. His defence was unavailing. I charged him with the terrible crime of witchcraft, and he was found guilty." A hollow groan broke from the monk, but he offered no other interruption. "He was condemned to die a fearful and lingering death," pursued the abbot, "and it devolved upon me to see the sentence carried out." "And no pity for the innocent moved you?" cried the monk. "You had no compunction?" "None," replied the abbot. "I rather rejoiced in the successful accomplishment of my scheme. The prey was fairly in my toils, and I would give him no chance of escape. Not to bring scandal upon the abbey, it was decided that Alvetham punishment should be secret." "A wise resolve," observed the monk. "Within the thickness of the dormitory walls is contrived a small, singularly formed dungeon," continued the abbot. "It consists of an arched cell, just large enough to hold the body of a captive, and permit him to stretch himself upon a straw pallet. A narrow staircase mounts upwards to a grated aperture in one of the buttresses, to admit air and light. Other opening is there none. Teter et Fortis Carcer is this dungeon styled in our monastic rolls, and it is well described, for it is black and strong enough. Food is admitted to the miserable inmate of the cell by means of a revolving stone, but no interchange of speech can be held with those without. A large stone is removed from the wall to admit the prisoner, and once immured, the masonry is mortised and made solid as before. The wretched captive does not long survive his doom, or it may be that he lives too long, for death must be a release from such a protracted misery. In this dark cell one of the evil-minded brethren who essayed to stab the Abbot of Kirkstall in the chapter house was thrust, and ere a year was over the provisions were untouched, and the man being known to be dead, they were stayed. His skeleton was found within the cell when it was opened to admit Borlace Alvetham." "Poor captive!" groaned the monk. "Ay, poor captive!" echoed Paslew. "Mine eyes have often striven to pierce these stone walls, and to see him lying there in that narrow chamber, or forcing his way upwards to catch a glimpse of the blue sky above him. When I have seen the swallows settle on the old buttress, or the thin grass growing between the stones waving there, I have thought of him." "Go on," said the monk. "I scarce can proceed," rejoined Paslew. "Little time was allowed Alvetham for preparation. That very night the fearful sentence was carried out. The stone was removed, and a new pallet placed in the cell. At midnight the prisoner was brought to the dormitory, the brethren chanting a doleful hymn. There he stood amidst them, his tall form towering above the rest, and his features pale as death. He protested his innocence, but he exhibited no fear, even when he saw the terrible preparations. When all was ready, he was led to the breach. At that awful moment his eye met mine, and I shall never forget the look. I might have saved him if I had spoken, but I would not speak. I turned away, and he was thrust into the breach. A fearful cry then rang in my ears, but it was instantly drowned by the mallets of the masons employed to fasten up the stone." There was a pause for a few moments, broken only by the sobs of the abbot. At length the monk spoke. "And the prisoner perished in the cell?" he demanded in a hollow voice. "I thought so till to night," replied the abbot; "but if he escaped, it must have been by miracle, or by the aid of those powers with whom he was charged with holding commerce." "He did escape," thundered the monk, throwing back his hood. "Look up, John Paslew. Look up, false abbot, and recognise thy victim." "Borlace Alvetham!" cried the abbot. "Is it indeed you?" "You see, and can you doubt?" replied the other. "But you shall now hear how I avoided the terrible death to which you procured my condemnation. You shall now learn how I am here to repay the wrong you did me.